Hello, everyone, and good afternoon, and welcome to the launch seminar for the latest ResPublica report on our trade deals and animal welfare. And it's with great pleasure that I also welcome our fellow panelists. We've got David Bowles, Head of Public Affairs at the RSPCA, Nick von Westenholz, who's Director of Trade and Business Strategy at the NFU, and Daniel Zeichner MP, who's Shadow Minister for Food, Farming and Fisheries. So here we are, and we're some time into post-Brexit Britain, to global Britain, as is, as was, and we've signed a number of trade deals already, most importantly with New Zealand and Australia. And one of the problems or issues rather in these trade deals is that Britain has, thanks to the good efforts of organisations such as the RSPCA and the NFU, Britain has some of the highest farm standards in the world, which in terms of brute open trade deals is an economic disadvantage because simply it costs more to produce food to these standards. And we are, broadly speaking, signing new trade deals with our trading partners that essentially don't require the same standards of production that we require of British farmers. What this essentially means is the domestic standards that we insist upon in the production of our own food put our farmers at quite an economic disadvantage with respect to the inputs that we now allow in. As such, in an era of supply chain uncertainty, worldwide food insecurity, we at the extreme risk making economically unviable a whole swathe of British domestic food production, which seems unwise from any number of viewpoints and issues. Now, we do have in the agreements that we've signed, we do have warm words about collaboration, but we have no insistence and no requirements present in those trade agreements. So there's no good or cogent reason to assume that this economic disadvantage won't become manifest and real, and British farmers won't pay the price. And in the end, that also means British consumers will also pay a price, having, in essence, food produced, despite their clear wish and intention, to standards that are lower than those we require of ourselves. That, in essence, is the nub of the discussion. And the paper itself goes on to make recommendations. But first, let's discuss the analysis with more detail. And I'd like to turn first to David from the RSPCA. David, can we have your thoughts on the present situation and its consequences for animals and animal welfare, please?
Yeah, thanks, Philip, and thanks to ResPublica for corralling the NFU and the RSPCA together to produce this. What I think is a really good report. The NFU and the RSPCA share common views on this issue. Indeed, the NFU have been arguing for something like core standards since 2020. They managed to get the government to move on agreeing a Trade and Agricultural Commission last year, which then produced its report saying we want common core standards in our trade policy. The government then set up a new commission, and that new commission produces its reports on New Zealand and Australia. And the government has made it clear that they are not going down the line of core standards. So I really just want to make 3 points in the time that I have. The first is the RSPCA last month was 198 years old. We were set up by an MP to investigate and enforce the world's first animal welfare law, which was passed exactly 200 years ago last Friday. And that was on farm animals. It was ensuring that animals driven to Smithfields were not cruelly beaten and were given humane treatment. So the RSPCA has been doing the job of trying to raise our standards for nearly 200 years. And in particular, over the last 40, 50 years under EU's membership, we have built up quite a good portfolio of animal welfare standards, which are broadly consistent with what the EU has. So we have got rid of the conventional battery cage on laying hens. We've got rid of sow stalls on pigs. We've got rid of the cruel veal crate system for dairy production. So there are an enormous amount of progress that the UK has made in conjunction with the EU over the last 40 years. And what we don't want to see, and certainly what the RSPCA does not want to see, is those standards which were hard fought and were discussed and were all based on scientific rationale to be squandered away and for us to export our animal welfare standards to other countries. So that's the first point. Let's keep what we have. Now, the second point is the government has a manifesto commitment not to lower animal welfare standards in free trade agreements. But what does this actually mean? Because as Philip has said, sometimes these are just warm words. And if you look at Australia and New Zealand, what you have is very good animal welfare chapters, which we do not have a problem with, but they are just warm words, because where the real action is the reduction of tariffs in both Australia and New Zealand. And what we've seen there is a reduction in tariffs on beef and lamb without any conditionality. And the problem that the RSPCA suggests will happen from this is that we could well see an increase, we certainly will see an increase in products coming in from those two countries on beef and lamb, but we could see products coming in which have not been produced to our standards. So with Australia, we have 5 different standards which are lower than the UK's. And that for us is a worry, but fortunately we are not yet at that critical stage, because obviously geography is against New Zealand and Australia exporting large amounts of, say, eggs or pigs or even chickens to us. Whereas the trade agreements that we're doing at the moment with Mexico, India, Canada, they are both geographically close enough to export those, and they will be asking the UK to do that very thing. So without the UK having those core standards and saying to the other guys, look, don't worry about this, it's not even worth mentioning this in your negotiations, because for us, this is a red line. They're being disingenuous, not just to the trade negotiators in those other countries, but also to the farmers and the producers in this country. And then my final point is, ironically, although the government have said that they don't really want to look at core standards, they have a consultation out now on procurement standards. And the UK has been in a very strange position for the last decade or so, in that it has allowed procurement managers to source food for our prisons, our schools, our educational colleges from abroad, produced to lower standards than the UK. And we know that they've done this. We know from certain producers that they have gone abroad to source products from other countries which are below our standards, because obviously it's cheaper to do so. And the government has recognised this, and they're closing that loophole. So ironically, what they're doing on procurement is saying our core standards are really important to us, and we don't want to have people that are procuring food for our colleges, prisons and schools going abroad and bringing in products which are produced to lower standards. Why then are they not prepared to do that for our trade strategy? And that's all that we're asking. Thank you, Philip.
Thank you, David. I mean, I think your point on procurement there, what we're now asking of our procurement managers that we're not asking of our trade partners is a point well made. What I'd like to do is turn to Nick now. Nick, could you outline, I think, if you would, some of the differences in the standards with both Australia and New Zealand, and why that puts British farmers at a disadvantage? And if you could sort of future gaze a bit, and building on David's point about if these principles are carried forward into other markets, what the outlook looks like for British farmers and British farming.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. And first of all, thanks very much to you and ResPublica for putting together this report. I think it's really well thought through and well argued paper, and actually takes a lot of the sort of sensationalism actually out of some of these debates, which have been out there for a while. I mean, to your sort of question, I think in particular, I'd like to focus on that bit you talked about, the sort of future gazing, because I think what's important and what the report is clear on is, the deals we've done with Australia and New Zealand are done. There is a debate, and there's it's reasonable that there's a debate over, firstly, where there are differences in standards, and clearly there are, not least because we are a very different type of country with a very different climate to Australia and New Zealand, and there are different approaches, and there are different, changing in both cases maybe, but different political environments to deal with the challenges of the future, such as climate change. So there are differences in standards, but the important point is that there is nothing in this deal, and in these deals, as David has said, if there were differences and if there were increases in imports from those countries into the UK, to somehow have some kind of controls or restrictions on imports produced at different standards. Now, whether or not that proves an issue with Australia and New Zealand is at the moment a moot point. What is clear is that this is the direction of travel we're going on. These are the first two trade deals in a whole load of bilateral trade deals our government is likely to seek to strike in the years ahead. And there are, of course, a whole host of negotiations that are already underway and already live, and we're probably going to see a couple of more concluded even this year. As David had pointed out, actually, with many of those countries, not only are they often closer, and therefore trade volumes could be increased more significantly, but often the differences in standards are starker. And if we follow the template of Australia and New Zealand deals with those countries, it's that cumulative impact which could really start having an effect. And that's important for two reasons. Firstly, what it means for UK farmers, and that's, of course, the constituency that I'm interested in. There is a live debate, has been for some time, but has really been to the fore in the last few years in the UK about the sorts of standards that UK farmers are producing to, both in terms of animal welfare and the environment. And there are a number of policies and indeed legislation going through at the moment which are looking to increase or strengthen those standards. So there's a direction of travel here in the UK that, if that is not matched by what we do in terms of our trade policy and our competitiveness with farmers from all over the world, is actually going to undermine that whole agenda. Because frankly and crudely, you end up with less British farmers producing less to those standards, and therefore less of that sort of food on the UK market. So it's really important for UK farmers. But it's also important, I think, for the efforts just to raise standards in food and farming production across the world. Again, whether that's in animal welfare or whether that's in climate-friendly, more sustainable farming. Now, I think there is a perfectly legitimate argument that free trade can be a driver for improving standards. It is not the case that you just say, well, actually, trade liberalisation automatically will lead to the lowest common denominator. But it could, and it could if it is not managed properly. It needs to be accompanied by agreements and mechanisms which ensure that you both liberalise trade, but at the same time you raise standards, not just here in the UK, but across the world. And I think this report is very important because it talks about ways that you can do that, and the UK could be a leader. So if the UK introduces core standards, and what this report talks about is a two-tier approach, actually, a kind of upper level, maybe just a handful to begin with, of really important core standards that you control in your import policy. And you argue at places like the WTO and with your bilateral trading partners that these standards are critical and therefore you shouldn't be trading goods in them. Certainly we shouldn't be importing them into the UK. And that sort of approach, and other countries and other trading blocs are beginning to look at this as well, and some are even a bit further ahead of where we'd be proposing. But actually, you begin to introduce that notion of production standards like animal welfare and environment as a legitimate trade policy instrument.
Nick, just a question of clarification. So these core standards then would form basis of our a priori requirements before we commence trade deals, or such that they form the substance of those trade deals without these sort of the empty verbiage around collaboration on standards for the future.
Yeah, so in a way, they do both. They do two things. They're both an aspect of bilateral trade negotiations and trade deals, but also they're an aspect of your general import policy wherever you're importing from. So the way that the report sets it out is that you actually have this upper tier of really important core kind of, non-negotiables, red lines, as it were. And that, as I say, that'll probably be, for a number of reasons, it'll only be a handful of things where you're very, certainly it's something that's restricted here. It cannot be something that you yourself are not banning, but something that's really important to people, and that most people would just not accept as being acceptable for imports. And there are, at the moment, that is not the way that things are done. So with that, you would simply say there are certain practices that we ban here in the UK, and we will not allow imports from anywhere that are produced using those practices. But on top of that, then you have what you might call, I think, more aspirational standards. So ones where you're not saying there's an outright ban on imports, and if other countries want to pursue those practices, then that is almost an issue for them. But you will not give them preferential tariffs under an FTA. And this is an idea which has been doing the rounds in a number of forms as well for a while, the idea of kind of conditional tariffs. So actually you say, when you do a trade deal and we liberalize tariffs on a number of products, it only applies to those that meet these certain standards. So you're not incentivizing economically that imbalance in standards where other countries might have different or lower standards than you, and then are exporting into the UK and competing with farmers who are not observing those same standards. So it's a kind of twin track approach, I guess.
What's again, just focusing in on the future gazing, Nick, the issue of sow stalls is quite sort of illustrative, perhaps. In the 1990s, sow stalls were banned in UK pig farming for animal welfare concerns, but not in other countries from which we imported. And people believed that the British consumer would continue to buy British. But on the contrary, the number of UK producers fell from almost 10,000 in 1999 to less than 6,000. And UK self-sufficiency in pig products fell from 80 to 50%. So that's quite a stark indication, I think, from recent history of how, if we don't get this right, the costs are borne by British farmers. What sectors do you think are most at risk, looking at the trade deals we've struck and are likely to strike in the future, where we could see a similar level of impact as we did with pig production?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I think you've got to be a little bit careful with crystal ball gazing. I mean, one of the points I've made about the Australia-New Zealand deals is actually we don't know what the impacts of those deals will be. You can guess a little bit, but it depends on so many variables. They already export, a lot into Far Eastern markets. They may continue to do that and not actually export the big volumes into the UK, but that might change. And those relationships around the Indo-Pacific might change. And so you may see volumes increase. And it obviously depends on the comparative advantage of the country that you're trading with. So obviously Australia are very strong in beef production, for example, also sheep production, New Zealand similarly, and dairy as well. So you can look and see, well, what if they decided to, and the market conditions were right, would they export to the UK in increasing volumes? And then it's those sectors in the UK that are potentially under risk. And if you, again, I mentioned it earlier, it's about a cumulative impact as well. The fact is, you're doing deals with these countries. We we have a trade deal with the USA on ice at the moment, but that could re-emerge. There are talks about South America, huge red meat producers, beef producers there. So the cumulative impact of all of those, it would, you know, the UK market would become incredibly competitive, and there would be therefore an economic risk. But the point you made about pigs is really important, because I mentioned it a moment ago. There's a lot of there's talk, which I think is not wrong, that free trade will drive up standards. Free trade can drive up standards by opening your markets to other entrants. And if your market is demanding high standards, then obviously they were going to have to meet their standards, and that might push their standards up. But if your market isn't, or if your market is not demanding the same standards imposed on your domestic farmers, then it won't. And the pig example was exactly an example of that. The UK consumer didn't opt to continue buying the same volumes of it. There was some continued purchasing, but the same volumes of UK pork. The UK consumer bought what was on the shop shelves, which was what the importers were bringing in from other countries more cheaply. We do need to be careful about the impacts of this. I mean, there are kind of separate issues, I would say. We are talking about standards, and there's lots of aspects to this. And as I said, the global leadership aspect is important as well. Separate to that, well, it's related, but it is a kind of an issue to one side, is the economic impact of these deals anyway, and the approach of the government to helping UK farming manage that potential economic impact. And one of the concerns we have is, the disconnect between domestic policy around standards and very liberalising trade policy that requires UK farmers to be more competitive, but actually the domestic policy isn't directed to achieving that.
Thank you very much. Daniel, what's your view and that of the Labour Party on these issues? We'd be most interested. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, Philip. And first of all, thank you to all of you for producing a very thorough and very good report, very timely. I think my reflections will partly go back to some of the debates we had around the Agriculture Act from a couple of years ago, when Labour put forward a whole series of amendments to try and tackle these very issues. We were very clear, we did not want to see British farmers being undercut by lower standards from these trade deals. Now, that was pretty hard fought at the time. The House of Lords fought hard on it as well. Under the influence, I suspect, of Nick and the NFU a bit. At the time, there were some concessions around the role of the Trade and Agriculture Commission, but we warned at the time that we didn't think that would be a particularly powerful tool. And I think the last couple of years have rather borne that out, because although their work has been important, I have to say that the scrutiny of the Australia trade deal was certainly quite an issue in the last few weeks before Parliament broke up for recess. And Angus MacNeil, who chairs the International Trade Committee, was furious, both at the Secretary of State's refusal to turn up to give evidence to his committee, but also to in the end, the lack of any real scrutiny by Parliament over the trade deal, which is what we predicted from a long way out. So we are concerned about this for a whole series of reasons, many of the reasons that both Nick and David have spelled out. But I'd add, possibly now in the last year or two, we've seen an additional reason too, which is around food security, which frankly, a couple of years ago, the government really wasn't taking very seriously. They only wanted to do an analysis of food security once every 5 years. They were knocked back by the House of Lords during the passage of the Agriculture Act. They sneaked out their first report on the last day before Christmas at the end of last year. And although it's a lengthy document and it's an interesting document, it doesn't really address, I don't think, the key question, which is how food secure we wish to be in the modern world. Tim Lang, in his excellent book a couple of years ago, Feeding Britain, talked about the dangers of having very long supply chains and the need for a powerful navy to defend them. It all sounded at the time, to me, a touch historical. But of course, sadly, with the situation in Ukraine, we're seeing that these issues are all too real. So there's a real question about how much food we produce here, to what standards. Labour is very committed to producing more. Rachel Reeves has made it one of the key planks for economic policy to make, buy and sell more in Britain. And that has significant impact, I would say, for UK farmers, and I think should be welcomed. But also in terms of public procurement, to make sure that more is being produced locally. And that also, I think, appeals to environmentalists as well, who question why exactly we would want to be moving food halfway around the planet when we can produce it much closer to home. And I think my final observation would be, I've just been in America talking to congressmen and others about the possibilities of an American trade deal. I was very struck everywhere we went that I don't think there's going to be any progress at all until the Northern Ireland Protocol is resolved. So given how difficult that is, I think it's fair to say that is some way away. I'd also say that the trade deals that have been struck so far, I think it's important to note the politics of it. Liz Truss obviously made it a big part of her thrust to get herself where she is today, to get those deals out the door quickly. And my understanding is that was the main impetus behind those deals. And I think we have probably given away quite a lot, frankly. And the problem with that is not just those two deals, but the deals that follow, because trade negotiators are pretty hard-headed people, and they will look at that and they certainly won't be expecting any less. So I think this is a challenge for UK farming. Exactly as Nick said, I think South America possibly ultimately is the bigger threat further down the line. An incoming Labour government will seek to do things differently. But clearly there are a whole range of trade-offs across a whole range of sectors. But our bottom line is we do not want to see standards lower, particularly on the animal welfare front. That was one of the issues that came up very strongly from constituents through the passage of the Agriculture Act. It always does. But certainly in terms of the economy and food production, we were very clear. And there's an interesting aside, when George Eustace was briefly out of government during the 2019 shenanigans, he himself tabled a whole series of very detailed amendments to the then agriculture bill, reflecting the fact that I think he too recognises that there is an issue here. So there's a lot of work to be done. We're watching it very closely, and we'll be developing our policies as we head to what we hope will be quite a general election sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Daniel. Just for everybody online, please post your questions to the panel, and you can list them in the Q&A session, and then we will take them in the order that they're given, and you're able to come online and ask them yourself if you would like, or if not, I will do that for you. But please post your questions. So the fundamental, as Nick pointed out, the fundamental thrust of the report is this: let's develop a set of core standards on animal welfare. And the quid pro quo is we will liberalise if other countries agree to meet those standards. And that is, as Nick has outlined, the way in which free markets can actually raise levels across the world. But absent that, it's really hard to see how we avoid what could only be what we've described elsewhere when ResPublica did a report on chicken, a two-tier food system being developed where expensive ethical food is only eaten by those who can afford it, whereas less expensive unethical food is cheaper and eaten by those who can afford it. And on the supply side, it leads effectively to the erasure of British farming. So a question to all three panelists. What the report has done, I think, if I may say so, in a very nuanced way, is chart a path forward. What do the panels think should be A, part of those core standards, and B, which is perhaps the more important question, how can we ensure that this actually happens and that the model that we've had for New Zealand and Australia isn't the one that's followed? Because path dependency is a powerful thing. And how are we going to insert these core standards, and what is the pathway by which we can advocate and achieve such? So I'll go Nick first, then David, then Daniel. Nick.
Thanks, Philip. Yeah, it's a very good question. I think the really important aspect of this is that it does require government to be involved at the outset. I've had discussions, because as David mentioned here, this idea of core standards is in various forms and ideas has been doing the rounds for a little while now. And people say, well, just kind of go ahead, get the kind of process rolling. And that is something that you know, has some merit. But to me, you need the government bought in and engaged right at the outset, because ultimately it's them or whatever hue the government is who will be managing and enforcing the system, and more importantly, arguing it in international forums such as WTO and in the forums created by some of these bilateral agreements, etc. So without that engagement and involvement at the outset, I think it's a high risk that you don't kind of get anywhere with this, which is why, you know, we need to keep making the argument now direct to government. And there is still time. You know, we've done 2 trade deals, but there's a whole load more. And as I said, actually, the risks of the future trade deals may be even more serious. So, you know, there is time now to do it. And I think the main thing that needs to be done is you look at your domestic standards. As I say, this has got to be based on domestic standards. What are the requirements that currently food producers, farmers, growers, etc., produce to, and working with them, working with other stakeholders, political parties, NGOs, civil society groups, etc. You alight on the really important ones, and in the report it does talk about some of the criteria you might use to do that. So that is really you coming on your core standards, your upper tier. With your second tier, it probably depends largely on who you're negotiating with. I mean, one of the interesting things about the Australian deal was actually it wasn't total liberalisation, because we didn't liberalise tariffs on products such as chickens and eggs and pork, ostensibly because we didn't feel that their production systems met our standards. So it is possible to actually think in this way in the trade deal. But those are not major industries for Australian producers. They do not export those products. And so there is really going to be very little impact of that decision in terms of this trade deal. So you've got to look at, on a case-by-case basis, actually, what are the important products being likely to be traded between the UK and the counterparty. But first and foremost, you need to go through that process, I think, about working out your core standards. You also need to think about how you're going to manage it and enforce it as well, which is not straightforward and does run the risk of the complexities of international trade law, but it is certainly not impossible to do either. So really, my takeaway would be the sooner we get going with this, the better.
This sounds to me, from what Nick's been saying, David, like a campaign ask, that the only real way we can pull this off is by persuading the government to actually adopt it and lead with it. I mean, it follows, I think, from the commitments they've made and from the recommendations that TAC made. But would that be your view as to how to achieve and attain this?
So my view is let's go back to what the government's manifesto is, which they won the 2019 election on, and in there it's very clear that there's a line which says the government will not lower animal welfare standards as part of any free trade agreement. So what does that mean? That sounds fantastic, but what does it actually mean? And the difficulty here is that the government has never said what it actually means. How are they going to measure that? They always point back to the Trade and Agriculture Commission and says, well, the Trade and Agriculture Commission said Australia was fine because it doesn't involve us changing our legislative standards. And that's being really disingenuous because, of course, our animal welfare standards, apart from one on slaughter, do not have any trade component. So saying it doesn't require us to change our standards just means it doesn't mean anything at all. And then they always go on and say, yes, but the TAC report says that we don't have to change our animal health standards, like allowing beef hormone or clawing chicken. And that's absolutely right, because animal health standards do have a trade and an import issue in them. So the government is quite happy to argue on the animal health argument and not allowing in beef treated with hormones or chlorine washed chicken or ractopamine fed pork. So they're quite happy to do that, but they're not happy to do that on animal welfare. And that to me is a slightly hypocritical. And I would totally agree with Nick that the first port is to start the conversation. Once you've started the conversation, then you have a round table where you get everybody together, and you can look at these on a case-by-case basis and negotiate what your core standards is. But the first step on this is to have that conversation. And in terms of enforcement, and I mentioned just now, we already have one core standard on animal welfare, which is that no meat is allowed to be imported into the UK unless it has been slaughtered in accordance with our standards, which have been in place on slaughter. That particular issue has been in place now for 27 years. And the way that we enforce it is we send out, or we used to when we were part of the EU, send out officials to countries to inspect and audit their abattoirs and only allow meat in from certain abattoirs. So it can clearly be done. And the interesting thing is, what's the EU doing? The EU is obviously our closest ally, our closest market for most of our products. You know, for things like beef, it takes 90% of our exports, and we import most of our beef from there, and the same for eggs and for chickens and even for pork, which is probably the lowest of the sectors in terms of where our exports go. So it's an important ally. And what the EU is doing is say, yes, actually core standards are important for us and we're going to set them up. So you've got this irony that our closest and most important market is already ahead of the curve on this with us. And they may well be coming back to us in a few years' time and say, if you're going to export your products to us, you have to meet our core standards. Wouldn't that be a bit ironic that the UK would have to go, oh, okay, we will do that. At the moment, they haven't even started on that journey. So I think the first and most important stage is to start on that journey, go back to basics, look at what is in the manifesto and say, what does it actually mean and how are we going to ensure that that promise is met?
Well, I agree, David. And again, this sounds to me like a campaign issue. It's not something we can formally submit through the existing channels, is it? It's something we've got to actually directly ask and approach the government about. Daniel.
Yeah, it's interesting you say it's a campaign issue, Philip. I mean, I think it's actually an argument within government, I would say, and possibly always will be, because there are going to be different industries, different sectors, and it depends where you put your priorities. And I think what we've seen in the trade deals already is that our agricultural standards and animal welfare standards aren't necessarily this government's top priority. Now, let me be realistic, that's always going to be a set of discussions that go on. But what I think is difficult, and I think this is partly because for my generation of politicians, these issues have not been something we've grown up on over the last 43 years, have largely been done through the European Union. So I would say our political culture has not caught up with these discussions yet. We saw quite a lot of interest a few years ago around TTIP and around the potential American trade deal then. But again, possibly amongst a fairly small segment of the population, though I have to say there was quite a lot of interest in my constituency in Cambridge around issues like intellectual property rights. But my point is, this is a very big political set of issues. And so far, it has not really been very clear to the wider public what is going on. In fact, it's interesting to see some of the leaks that have come out from within the current government suggesting that they are very well aware of some of the potential economic impact on agriculture, but they chose to carry on regardless. So you get a bold statement like, we will not allow lower standards in a manifesto. Well, there are many, many ways in which that can be cut and diced through the period of of a complicated set of trade negotiations. So I think what we actually need is a much more open and honest dialogue with the public and across the board, not just as a campaign issue, but going back to the structural point about how we make these decisions, because obviously other countries, Americans in particular, have a much more difficult process for these deals to be achieved, because Congress has a say. Now, Parliament doesn't have a say. So you can argue which is the better system, but I would say at the moment, to some extent, you're right, it will require pressure, but there will be political trade-offs.
The audience we have has stayed with us and is engrossed, and so engrossed are they that we have one question about affordability and ethics. So Angela's come in. So let's try and answer Angela's question. So Angela asks, some animal welfare standards are primarily moral issues, but some also help us manage global risks to public health, like zoonosis or AMR. Should they be treated differently by core standards? So what Angela's raising there is a question I flagged slightly earlier, and it's also in the report. How do you factor in things like the destruction of tropical rainforests for beef production, which we mentioned in the core standards, versus kind of issues of cruelty that I think particularly resonate with British consumers? What are the sort of parameters for deciding that? Because we already have, do we not, an ethics versus cost issue in the sense of, and one can imagine hearing this in government, you know, affordability versus cruelty, battery farmed eggs versus free range. What sort of, could we have a little bit of shape on the core standards we might want to insist upon, you know, in relationship to both the domestic question of affordability versus cruelty and also the wider climate kind of impact type questions? So David, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, Angela's absolutely right that some welfare standards are moral issues, but they are very important to the public. And Daniel was absolutely correct that the trade deals haven't got a lot of media profile, a lot of public profile, because, well, firstly, they are quite complicated to understand. And also there are many other different things rightly that getting that profile at the moment that are in the media. So we shouldn't forget that animal welfare standards are, by and large, heavily supported by the public. I mentioned just now the RSPCA, 198 years old. We were the first animal welfare organization in the world, but we were one of the first organizations in the world. And that shows the length of history in the UK on animal welfare standards. Our first legislation, 200 years old, and also shows the length of history on these issues. And it is a truism, and Daniel can probably talk to this, that the MPs get more letters and emails on animal welfare than you do on virtually every other issue. So there is a huge amount of public concern on this. When we do our polling, the polls consistently say that they don't want these products coming in produced to lower standards. But there is actually a different perception. So when you do it on, say, do you want a trade deal with America, bringing in their products, you're up to 80–90% of people saying no. When you do it the same on Australia, because people have this image of neighbours and surfer dudes and that sort of thing, you go down to about 60%. So that there needs to be, even though Australia and America frighteningly have similar standards on some of these issues, there needs to be, I think, an honest conversation about this. And as Nick rightly said, when you come down to the issue of looking at what standards you're going to be doing, then you get together the important people, the producers, the animal welfare people, the consumer people, and you have a conversation about this, because this is not just an animal welfare issue. It's also a consumer issue, that we don't want the consumer being duped into buying things that they say in polls that they wouldn't want to buy. And it's also, to a certain extent, an animal health issue as well. So for instance, the Trade and Agriculture Commission was quite clear that for certain products, the pesticide levels in Australia are much higher than they are in the UK. What impact that's going to have on those products is yet to be agreed. So there are important issues, I think, that need to be worked through here. But the most important thing is for the government to start that conversation. I mean, Daniel said that the government's main aim has been to agree as many trade deals as possible. And I think, the UK government does not have a trade strategy. And I think in light of the trade strategy, the only trade strategy they have is let's agree as many trade deals as possible to make us look free out of Brexit and good on the global scale. But to be honest, from the RSPCA's perspective, you can agree as many trade deals as you want. If you're selling off the family silver, that doesn't mean they're good trade deals.
Thank you, David. Daniel.
Well, I very much agree with David, as you might well imagine on that. I was just going to add a few things here. I mean, Nick's comments will be interesting because he's far more expert on this than I am. In fact, I suspect I learned most of it from him. But the details of how the WTO works and what is within and not within scope on some of these things is significant here. And certainly, I suspect different cultural attitudes are a very, very difficult area to include. So, but having said all that, as we've seen with international diplomacy or lack of in the last few years with Trump and so on, trade arguments are pretty blunt tools. So we certainly, as a country that takes animal welfare standards very seriously, I think would be right to be looking at some of those things, just as a Labour government would want to look at things like workers' conditions. So there are a whole series of things that come in here. I was going to actually pick up on the pesticide point that David talked about, because there are significant differences between the Australian approach, for instance, and ours. Now, that can raise legitimate questions as to whether we've got it right or they've got it right. But there is a sort of illogicality there that we've got one set of rules which apply to UK producers, which quite clearly are not applying on some of those imported goods. And some of this comes down to a fairly fundamental difference of view, which the Conservative government is trying to move us away from a European-style approach to risk, which they see as being overcautious. Some of us think is a very good idea. So there's a big debate going on, and through much of the environmental legislation the last few months, environmental lawyers have been arguing about this shift from a hazard-based approach to a risk-based approach. Now, I guess it's all a bit technical, but actually it goes to the heart of some of these things. And just finally, I'd make a point which did strike me in the report, that I don't think personally relying on labelling and individual consumer choice is going to be the answer to any of these things. Not that I don't think it's good to give consumers choice and as much information as possible, but I think for the reasons you outlined right at the beginning, Philip, particularly in times of stress, price is going to be a key determinant for many, many people, understandably so. So if you're trying to maintain your standards and to some extent protect, in inverted commas, your producers, relying on individual purchasing decisions seems to me to be a very weak way to do it. I think you've got to do it in the trade deal and government has to do it. Thank you, Daniel. Nick.
Thanks. To Angela's questions, it's a great question. And I think actually the report quite neatly does a bit of a sort of layperson's kind of explanation of the different approaches in trade policy and trade law to product standards rather than production standards, which are primarily around things like environmental protection and animal welfare. But you do get this sort of interesting grey area, which is sort of growing in the middle about things like antimicrobial resistance, about things like climate change, for example, where a poor practice can lead to really bad outcomes for either animal health or human health, like, for example, climate change. And that sounds like totally underplaying an incredibly important issue, the way that I describe that. But it's not about the product that is entering your country. That product in itself that you're importing doesn't pose the threat. So you're going to be fettered in as much as you can actually, under current approaches, restrict or ban that import. It seems to me that actually this is probably lower hanging fruit than a lot of the other stuff we're talking about, where you say actually production standards that have an impact on the climate, negative impact on the climate, or pose a kind of global health issue, like, for example, antimicrobial resistance, that should qualify as something that can be dealt with in a similar way to SPS concerns. That, you know, actually we're not going to allow, or we're certainly not going to encourage and incentivize through trade policy that sort of production. Of course, we can't go into other countries and just, you know, demand what their laws are, but certainly we can use more indirect tools, for example, our trade policy and the way that we liberalize trade. So I do think that actually that is where there's got to be scope for quite an immediate and potentially fruitful discussion. How you police and enforce standards. There's still production standards, but there's production standards with a health and health implication, rather than the more sort of ethical implications of a lot of animal welfare issues, for example.
Well, we've really had a fascinating discussion, and I think we've gone to quite sort of an explicit conclusion, really. I think the conclusion is the conclusion and the fundamental recommendation of the report, the development as soon as possible of a set of core standards that we will require all subsequent market liberalisation to meet. And I think that that's the clear thrust and recommendation of the report, and that is what stands in very close symmetry with everything the government has said, both manifesto-wise and when it set up the TAC committee. Secondly, what I think Nick has flagged in response to Angela's question is really the distinction between product and production standards. Heretofore, we've mostly limited just product standards, but the nature of the world as it is now means that we've got to factor production standards, how the product is produced, even if that product is safe. If it's produced in a way that causes wider damage, they have to also form part of those core standards. And I'm left with the thought that this is indeed, if colleagues, you'll forgive me, a campaign issue. There's no formal, I mean, obviously the Labour Party can table amendments and act in government, but for those of us outside of government, there's no formal approach to realise these core standards other than to start the discussion and start to form them, really, and then press government on it. But we now approach the end of the session, so I'd just like, if I may, to ask colleagues in the order they originally spoke for a 1-2 minute summary of next steps. David.
Yeah, thank you, Philip. So you're absolutely right, and I think there are probably two next steps. One is to draw up those particular core standards and get that discussion happening as to how the government are going to implement their manifesto commitment. In just over a month, we will have a new Prime Minister, and that to me would be top of their in tray in looking at what they're going to do. The second thing, and a lot of people, Nick's absolutely right, and you're absolutely right, Philip, to draw the distinction between product and production standards. What a lot of people forget is the UK already has a number of import bans based on production standards. We do not allow seal products in because we believe they are cruelly killed in Canada and Norway. We do not allow dog and cat products in because we believe they are cruelly killed in China. Those are production standards based on method of production. So we already do that, and I think there is an opportunity here for the UK to show leadership at the WTO, start that conversation at the WTO, because WTO rules are not that clear on it, despite those import bans that already exist. And within each of the Australia and New Zealand free trade agreements, there is a paragraph that says we will cooperate together on introducing and having that discussion in the WTO. So let's start that discussion as well within the WTO. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Nick?
Yeah, I mean, I won't go over what David's just said. I think he's right. But what I would add, and it's related to that, is and somebody touched on it earlier, I can't remember who, actually a more coherent and detailed trade strategy from the government would help a lot. The fact is that we've been sort of slightly reaching around and lurching around in the dark. As far as I can see, the trade strategy has primarily been to do trade deals as quickly as possible. And to be frank, it's not very difficult to do any deal with anybody on anything as quickly as possible if you want to. What's difficult is doing a trade deal where you get as much as you can that's in your interest. That takes more time and is more complicated. But if you have a very clear trade strategy, it sets out exactly what you want to achieve over a longer time frame, what your red lines are, what your ultimate objectives are, what you expect the economic impacts of your trade strategy to be, and what you think the other aspects of it, for example, import controls and import standards are, then you can firstly get a lot more support more broadly for that. It also makes the negotiations more straightforward. You've got a very clear framework in which to go into those negotiations. And let's be honest, trade negotiations are primarily transactional. Both sides usually want to just get what they can for mutual benefit, of course. But if you have a clearer trade strategy laid out, that does, I think, become more straightforward, and we could achieve a lot more. We could achieve more of those sort of win-win. So I think that would be something I would argue strongly for on top of what's already been said.
Thanks, Nick. Daniel?
I may sound a little bit more cynical, I'm afraid. I think there is a trade strategy, and it is not to have a trade strategy, because it leaves maximum flexibility for the government to make the trade-offs it wants to make. I suspect all governments like as much freedom as possible. So this is a difficult area. Oppositions inevitably will say one thing when you're in government. Possibly you tend to nuance it a little in the light when you collide with the reality of those power struggles. But having said that, I think there are some very basic principles that certainly Labour's attached to around core standards and labour standards in particular, and welfare standards and production standards in terms of agriculture. So I hope we'll go into an election. We haven't made decisions yet on these things, with a position that will allow us to have a strategy in a way that the current government has not had one. And I think that's been part of the problem. And part of the problem, of course, all of this has been developed against the backdrop of leaving the European Union, which has coloured the way in which this has developed. I think we've got a long way to go, frankly, in developing a principled approach to doing these things. And it may take a while, because, as I say, we've not had to do it for a very, very long time. But it really does matter, particularly to producers and particularly to people who care about animal welfare standards. So having started by saying I'm a touch cynical, I will always try and retain my optimism and hope we can do better.
Thank you very much. And thanks very much to all of my colleagues and after our time working together, friends on the panel. I thought it was fascinating. I think we've got a clear and penetrating analysis in the report of where we are and now where we need to get to. We were asked where we can access the report. It's on the ResPublica's Twitter feed, it's on the RSPCA's Twitter feed, and no doubt on the NFU Twitter feed. My colleague has just posted it on here, and it's of course on the ResPublica website as well. So hopefully that's enough out there for you to be able to access it. Please come back to us at ResPublica if you'd like to inquire further about this sort of work. And in the meantime, thank you so much for joining us, and we wish you all the best for the rest of, well, the week, the year, and so on. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.